So yeah, when we got together Thursday lunch, I think it's curve and do it. Wow, I got it. Two industrial and utilities. I know, but and then doing the same tonight.
Yeah. The whole WCU continued.
When you're driving through, you see all that fiber. Oh yeah, the schools and that. Yeah. It was all stuck. So they bought extra.
Do we have anyone else remotely?
I driving through there.
Chris and Michelle. And Michelle. Right?
Oh, and Dan.
Mark, I should have been involved in the draft contract. I'm just gonna ask you. Tim's worked through, we got all the occasions that we'll be removed from it. Our legal is just reviewing it now, so that we just get it cleaned up and then we'll get it over.
Another scenario. What's your? You don't even have to answer that.
A lot of the same. A lot of the same. It's unfortunate, but it's like, I really hope. Yeah, I really hope that, I mean, obviously for us, that's a great job.
So it's already. Yeah.
I mean, on the positive side, we've got, on the collection side, we're really, that's a very positive conversation. I'm not concerned about us being able to have those agreements in place. Our topic being released from biosolids.
Well, it's just easy.
You have so much less volume. That's why I said that we're just talking about.
Straddling
Maybe survive.
So do you want?
We have 3 tiers of look. One last night, we're looking at 2 now.
All right, everybody. Force the conversation to close. Welcome, everybody. Very excited to introduce you all to our water supply alternatives refinement workshop. It's really great to see so many faces in the same room, many of whom I've mostly seen on that end, and technology doesn't always seem to be my best friend. So I'm glad everybody is here today. We'll go ahead. We've got a little bit of the agenda up here on the board. We'll start with a welcome and introductions. We'll move on to, I think Robin's going to lead us through a lot of the Alta study findings and recommendations. I want to start off by introducing Selena Cord. I believe we've actually met quite a few people around the room, potentially even making rounds, but our new executive director is here and I'm super excited about it, and she's getting familiarized. And so we'll start with you. I guess I introduced you, Selena, but we can go around the room and do introductions to everybody else as well.
I want to make sure folks on Zoom, can you hear us? Can you,
It's already keeping me in line.
I don't know, give us a thumbs up or a hands up or unmute and say yes.
I think something.
Yes, we can hear you.
Great, thank you.
Do we need to try and get a speaker water so we can?
I will turn that up.
When we're ready. Okay, perfect. Okay, well, my name is Kara Haley. I'm the current PBAC chair. I work for the City of Pullman Public Works Department. And I'm just glad to be here today.
I'm Eileen McCall, Pullman City Council Representative to PBAC.
Jeff Lennigan, Associate Director for Utilities with WSU Facility Services.
Jason Sampson, Environmental Health and Safety for Washington State.
Tyler Palmer, I'm City of Moscow's PBAC rep and vice chair.
Paul Kimmel, I'm Latah County Representative to PBAC.
I'm Tim Lake, Professor of Hydrology, University of Idaho, and one of the UI reps.
Mark Story, Whitman County Public Works Director and a longtime PBAC member.
Sean Coates, City of Pullman Public Works Director and PBAC member.
Rusty Vineyard, Director of Facilities, University of Idaho.
So I'm Patrick Cabbage with the Washington State Department of Ecology. I'm a hydrogeologist out of the Spokane office.
And I'm Robin Nimmer with Alta Science and Engineering.
Let's jump to the computer and then we'll jump back to a couple of guests that we have in the room. Let's start with Michelle. Maybe. Oh, should we turn the sound up when we do that? Hold on a sec, Michelle.
Hello, I'm Michelle Richmond. I'm with Idaho Department of Water Resources in Coeur d'Alene, the regional manager.
Awesome. I see Steve. A moment here. Uh-oh, Steve. Let's try that again. Maybe. Here he is. Steve, are you with us? I've never heard Steve sound that way before. I think we're having a little technical difficulties sound-wise, Steve.
Still like the chipmunks.
Did we get a chance to talk with him before the meeting kicked up and we heard sound?
No.
No, okay. So might improvise there. Steve, you must be using your computer messaging. We don't have a number to call him, do we? That'll connect to this.
We also have Daniel Sturgis here in Idaho Department of Water Resources.
Thank you, Michelle. Hi, Daniel. Good to see you both in the same room. Oh, I actually see, I was gonna get down the list to you because I see you logged in there as well. And
he doesn't have a camera or a mic. So we might pop in and out of my room.
okay, well, we like that too. That works. I see we have Chris Beard. We'll work on Steve Robichon here in a bit. He's gonna try. Chris.
Beard. Yep. Chris Beard, hydrogeologist, Department of Ecology Water Resources Program out of Spokane.
All right. Glad you're here with us remotely. I have Pamela on the line.
Hi, Pamela, community member.
Great. Thanks for joining us today, Pamela. I see a number from the Daily News. Do you want to do a quick introduction? Maybe somebody from the Daily News is on the line. Let's do our two folks in the room over here and then we'll check back with Steve. Jean Elliott, community member. Hi, Jean.
David Holmes, stakeholder engagement group member.
Awesome. We're glad you guys are here with us today. Steve, do you want to take another stab at talking?
Okay, I left the meeting and came back. Can you hear me this time?
We can hear you. Steve Robichon is our technical advisor, and he's probably joining us from somewhere even hotter than here. All right, did I miss anyone who hasn't introduced themselves? I don't think I've missed anybody. So I think we'll go ahead and jump into our first agenda item. I'll pass it off to Robin.
Hey, Jeff. How are you?
Good.
Gotta love technology.
voluntary last.
Other than Steve's Chipmunk voice.
Retirement.
Oh.
Definitely sounds better.
Okay.
Okay,
So we're good, we're good.
all right, awesome. Should we do a quick check and make sure folks on the other side of the room can be heard? Oh, why don't you say something nice and loud?
Nice and loud.
Do we all hear that? Maybe?
Okay.
So you didn't
Thumbs
say
up.
anything during introductions?
Yes.
Okay.
All right, welcome everybody. I am really excited to be here. It's pretty exciting to go from where we were about a year and a half ago, starting this whole process to where we are right now, really getting down to business. So with that, we'll get started. All right, Kara already went through today's agenda. So we'll just now recap the findings. And then what I'd really like for us to do is to have the discussion and see what PBAC would recommend, you know, the top one or two alternatives. Get to that point, then we'll take a break. And then we'll have some more discussion. And then on your agenda, there's quite a number of discussion items. We can go through anything else you guys want to talk about. And then we'll talk about next steps, timeline, and benchmarks. Really walk out of here, I think, with some more action items, some time bounding on things, maybe some roles and responsibilities to some extent. Okay, so some outcomes, like I mentioned, having feedback recommendations for alternatives moving forward would be great. Just having a dialogue on some of these discussion items, get that started, as well as developing some of those near-term next steps and timeline, and then we'll check and see how we did at the end. Okay, so just a project summary. Usually when I do these presentations, I kind of recap everything we've been doing. So I won't do that today, but we have done quite a bit of outreach. I would say within the last year, given quite a few presentations to a variety of different groups. We've developed interim steps, looking at the costs and schedule for those, capital costs, as well as O&M costs. We've investigated water rates for Idaho and Washington, looking at, you know, any red flags that we've identified, and really what we saw were there no major red flags. There are not sufficient water rates to purchase, so we would need to get new water rates for any of these alternatives. But we also could purchase theoretically some of the existing ones, and then also having discussions with the different agencies. So state agencies, ecology, IWR, Idaho Water Resource Board, as well as the Nez Tribe, and then various fisheries agencies. Okay, so I'm going to jump right into the alternatives, and so this is going to be a lot of review. So the first one is a single diversion project on the Snake River. We'll divert water near Hawaii is the plan, with the pipeline to Pullman, near Pullman for a regional water treatment plant, and then a pipeline to Pullman. And then later, the treatment plant could be pulled out with the pipeline to the city of Moscow. And this diversion would be 10 months out of the year for direct use. And this is estimated to provide about 85% of the target, although it could be more if you had a larger pipeline. And when the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers originally did this project, they had, I think, 31 CFS. And then when the city of Moscow did a surface water reservoir project, they were looking at scaling it back to, I think it was closer to 10 CFS. And so I think that's, you know, there's a history of these alternatives to where we got to where we are. There is the potential to partner with a local utility on a pump storage project. That's a potential option. And I also wanted to point out, it's interesting this morning in the paper, looking at, there's an article on the dam breaching, and Governor Inslee and I think Patty, one of the other legislators. So anyway, I just wanted to point out that dam breaching, you know, it's not a deal breaker. It would require the pipeline to be deeper. And so whether the project is started, then you have to do that afterward, it's an increased cost, or it would be an increased cost even anyway, just to have a deeper pipeline, but also increased energy costs. So the O&M costs would go up. And it sounds like it could be pretty significant depending on, you know, the deeper you go, the greater that cost is going to be. Okay, alternative 2 has 2 diversion projects. The first one is an intake and water treatment plant for aquifer recharge on the South Fork of the Palouse River or Paradise Creek. And this would be for aquifer recharge. The other one is a regional intake near Palouse on the North Fork of the Palouse River with a pipeline to a regional treatment plant. And then the pipeline would go to Pullman first, followed by Moscow second. And I think that's just because the intake is in Washington. You would just keep the pipeline in Washington and then go to Idaho afterwards. This would be diverting 4 months out of the year. The North Fork of the Palouse would be diverting 8 months out of the year. And this is estimated to provide 82% of the target, although it may not consistently produce enough water to sufficiently meet the demand. Okay, alternative 3, 2 separate projects. So the first one is to divert water from the South Fork of the Palouse River in Pullman, an intake and water treatment plant. This would be for direct use and diverting 8 months out of the year. Then the other one is surface water reservoir and dam structure on Flanagan Creek with a pipeline to a water treatment plant in Moscow, and that would be for direct use. And this is diverting 12 months out of the year. That's diverting South Fork is 8 months out of the year. And then this is estimated to provide 100% of the target. Okay, alternative 4 has 5 components, and the first one is South Fork of the Palouse River in Pullman. This is for aquifer storage and recovery water treatment plant, diverting 8 months out of the year. The other one is Paradise Creek aquifer recharge in Moscow, diverting 4 months out of the year. The other one is wastewater reuse in Pullman, and that would be diverting 6 months out of the year, followed by passive recharge in Moscow for their wastewater, the effluent from wastewater treatment plant, passively recharging the aquifer, and that would be 12 months out of the year. And then the remaining would be additional conservation, and this is about 15% greater than what we're currently doing, or as of a couple of years ago. And this is estimated to provide 81% of the target, although it may not consistently produce enough to meet the demand. Okay, so this is a table with the schedule and cost. These are things that you have seen before, but we just go through the alternative number, the description, and then how long it's going to take to implement. So additional conservation, they estimated about 6 years. Then the remainder, the wastewater reuse would be about 9 years. The rest of them would take 11 to 12 years. So it's just good to get a concept of how long this project would take once we actually say go. The estimated capital cost is listed over here on the right, and then by alternative. So the most expensive is alternative 4, followed by alternative 1, the Snake River, and then by alternative 3, and last by alternative 2. Okay, so as we were doing this study, we were really looking at alternative 4. We were gathering feedback from people, and some people are a little concerned about aquifer recharge, aquifer storage, and recovery. So what could we do to modify one of these alternatives? And then we also looked at the cost efficiency for some of these. There's some pretty expensive components. So we looked at alternative 4, and so we got rid of, well, basically we decided to do direct use for South Fork of the Palouse River in Pullman and Paradise Creek in Moscow. And then removing water reuse in Pullman just because of the really high dollar amount. It's $53 million, and you really don't get that much supply because it's so far away from where you would actually use the water. And then water reuse in Moscow, again, that was because it's water reuse, we removed that one. So the reason that South Fork of the Palouse Pullman, the dollar amount increased is because you're increasing the supply. And just to give you a little background, what I believe happened when they were developing these alternatives is Paradise Creek for Moscow, that supply and cost is about $18 million. So I think what they decided to do is just have the same thing for Pullman, South Fork. They said we're going to have the same supply and it's going to be the same cost. So what we did here, the 28 million is actually just pulling from alternative 3A. So you could, could you have a bigger supply for ASR and Pullman? And I think you probably could, but that just gives you some context. So now alternative 4 is the lowest and it's 73.8 million.
And all those updated numbers for alternative 4 did include the addition of the necessary storage to accommodate direct use versus.
No, so the cost didn't change. We didn't include any storage. Okay, and then this is just what alternative 4, modified alternative 4 looks like. So South Fork direct use 8 months, and then intake and treatment plant for direct use for South Fork. And that is a really good point that I wanted to point out is when you do direct use versus ASR, I mean, when we're doing aquifer storage and recovery or aquifer recharge, you are storing that water in the aquifer. And so, for example, with Paradise Creek, you're diverting January through April, but when we use the water, mostly it's going to be in the summertime. And so there'll be a period of time where we wouldn't be able to use all the water from surface water because we're just not there yet for that water use. So that's something to consider for this alternative, really for any of the direct use alternatives. And then this is estimated to provide 80% of the target, and again, it may not consistently produce enough water, and it also includes that additional conservation. Okay, so these are graphs. These are in the report. So first we'll take a look at the capital cost. So the numbers on the bottom are just the different alternative numbers, and then the colors represent, they match the spreadsheet in the table that's in the report. But alternative 1 is at Snake River. So the highest capital cost, which we showed before, is alternative 4, followed by alternative 1, alternative 3, and then modified 4. Well, I think 2 is a little bit more expensive than modified 4. And then the different colors and the different numbers represent the different interim steps for those. So you can see with with alternative 1A, the largest chunk of that capital cost is just to get the water to Pullman and build that treatment plant. Then 1B just further builds out a little bit and gets you that pipeline to Moscow. And then the different colors associated and now modified for correspond with the other alternatives. So for example, 4B is actually the same as 2A. And I know these are just like numbers right here, but when you're actually, have the report in front of you and are looking at it, it would make a little bit more sense. 4E, that's the additional conservation, that's 4C. And then 4A is the same as 3A. Okay, then looking at the annual operating costs, so you can see that alternative 1 has pretty significantly more operating costs, about $2 million more than alternative 3. Alternative 3 is next, followed by 2, and then 4, and then modified 4. And if you have any questions on these, I'm going to feel free to ask.
Did we do an overlay of those two things to get to? I'm just wondering, like a total life cycle cost, figuring it'd be a combination of financing and operating costs that would probably turn into a rate increase or something like that effect. So knowing kind of how those.
We did do total present value.
Okay.
But I don't think we did what you were just saying.
Okay. Okay.
How hard is that to do, Jeff?
Good question.
It seems like we have the data for it. Wouldn't we?
Well, I think I'm expecting that would be a question that we would want to know, over the life cycle of whatever the improvement, and maybe you're gonna have to finance it to build it and then operate it. And then that probably would be reflected in the rate. So it might be interesting to kind of compare the options in that perspective.
Did the present value include the annual operating cost?
Yes. So that'll be one more slide after this. I'll show that one. So these are some graphs, and I know this might be a little hard to see, but the whole idea is to be able to compare the alternatives. So each one of these graphs, on the x-axis, it's the supplemental supply target in acre feet per year, and then the y-axis is the capital cost to implement. And it just gives you a good idea for how much money it would take to get any water out of it. Like for example, alternative 1, it costs, about $90 million just to get some water, versus all the other alternatives, it's $20 to $30 million before you can get any water.
Hey, Robin, can I ask, so just to be clear, we didn't change that 50-year target, supply target, right? We did that.
That's the same. Yeah, a lot of this, the whole basis is what came out of the PBAC study. Yes.
Right.
Let's see, another one to point out, what I mentioned about the wastewater reuse in Pullman, it costs quite a bit of money, but you don't get much supply. So this is just a good way to view it. A lot of this it's the same data, just looking at it differently can tell you something different, and it might resonate with Tyler or with Mark. It just depends on how people see things. And then alternative 4, this one's a little bit more, the steps are a little bit more similar, although sulfur pools, you do get more supply. It's always nice to see a little bit of a jump and then more of, a greater amount of supply versus something like that. Okay, and so this is a graph of the total present value. So this is looking out 50 years. This includes capital costs and annual operating costs. So each of the dark bars represents each of the interim steps. Each of the light bars represents the alternative as a whole. And so just looking at the gray bar, the light gray bars, you can see the alternative 1 still has the highest total present value, followed by, it looks like 3, then 2, and then modified 4 if you exclude 4. Does this help, Jeff?
I'm trying to wrap my brain around that, but I think so. I'll study it.
Okay, and we have the spreadsheet, and I think that was one of the things that might have gone out to feedback. So I can always, we can chat afterwards.
Okay, thank you.
All right, so back in February, we had a workshop where we talked about the matrix, because we have these alternatives. There aren't really any that are just, shining, saying, pick me. So how are we going to evaluate this? So we used the same matrix that PBAC used in their report, that they had worked with PBAC, you came up with a matrix. So we wanted to reevaluate that and make sure, are these the criteria that we want to use? Are these the weights that we want to use? So the first 8 are the same criteria. And so we looked at the unit cost of supply, the long-term reliability, the technical certainty of success, property acquisition, permitting complexity, water rates and environmental, the extent of regional agreements required, public acceptability, and then we added surface water quality impacts. And so that would the intake be downstream of an industrial or a wastewater treatment plant? And then aquifer quality impacts, really are we injecting treated water into the aquifer? And then the weights we did adjust those a little bit. And so the unit cost of supply went down from a 10 to a 9. We said it's important, but it's not the most important part of this. And then the long-term supply reliability, feedback, this is really important. That's part of our mission. The remainder of these, they're important, but they're not as important. The extent of regional agreements required, we lowered that because although it's important, we don't want that to be a deal stopper. And then public acceptability, PBAC raised that because they said, what the public thinks is really important to us. And then the other ones, again, are kind of that midpoint of 6. So then each of the criteria have they have a rating score, which range from 0 to 3, with 3 being the highest. And then those scores were multiplied by the weights and then added together, and that's how we got the total scores. So this is the table for alternatives 1 through 4. And the reason that we had to do a table with 4 and a table with the modified 4, this is because how we incorporate the unit cost of supply. It zeroes out the most expensive one, and that changed. So what we've come up with is alternative 3 is ranked the highest. It has the highest score, followed by alternative 2, alternative 1, and last by alternative 4. And you can see that the scores, there's a pretty good range. There aren't any alternatives that are really close together, where they're kind of borderline. With modified alternative 4, things should shift a little bit. Instead of 4 being last, now modified 4 is first, and then followed by alternative 3, 2, and last by Snake River. And again, these scores, there's quite a range in those scores. There's anything that's really close together. All right, so now we get to our recommendations. So we have all this information. What is Alta going to recommend to PBAC? So we were looking in the very beginning, we said we're going to recommend the top 1 or 2 alternatives. And I am much more comfortable recommending 2 versus just 1, because again, there isn't anything that was, this pick-me alternative. So the first alternative that we chose to recommend is the modified alternative 4, ranked highest in the matrix. And then just some other pros, the ease of ability to conduct interim steps, and that the water removed and used stays within the same state. So this is with, this alternative has interim steps that doesn't have a lot of water. So that's one of the things that I mentioned before, is may not consistently produce enough water. So we wanted to have another alternative that would do that we would feel more confident. So for that one, we chose alternative 3, and it ranked second highest in the matrix. And just some other pros with that, it has a larger water supply compared to modified 4, which means we're going to have greater fishery agency support, the ease of ability to conduct the interim steps, and the same, water from Washington State and Washington and vice versa, and it is estimated to meet the supply target. So as I was working on the draft of the report, it was, okay, having that second recommended alternative, do we choose alternative 3 or do we choose alternative 1? So one of the things I was grappling with is, should I say 3 or 1? But really for these reasons, I chose alternative 3. We chose alternative 3. But as far as something for you to consider, I thought it would help to compare alternatives 1 and 3. And this is just kind of some snippets from that matrix. And the red circles have, in comparison from 1 to 3, the highest ranking. So you can see that alternative 3 has higher scores for most things except for long-term supply reliability and that technical certainty of success. So these are all the things that we said are important. And this is how it shook out. So the scores are pretty different, 123 versus 99. So with the matrix, we tried to quantify qualitative things. And so if this is where, we really need to put in our thinking hats and say, okay, this is great. This is what the numbers came up with, but what do we really think, and talk through some of these pros and cons. And you don't necessarily have to follow through with what the matrix shows, but it's certainly something to consider because it's a tool. Okay, so with that, I can answer any questions, and that's where we really start to get your feedback and see what you guys think. I think some questions to ask yourselves are, how many alternatives do you want to move forward? The whole idea with hiring us to help you and look at these interim steps is to narrow them down, because at some point you really can't keep moving all forward. The funding agencies have said, we would really like you to select 1, and I think you could select 1, or you decide you want to move forward with 2 of them. With alternative modified 4, if you move forward with just that one and you get down the road and you realize there's just not enough water, now you have to go back and bring in one of these other alternatives, versus if you bring along 2 at the same time, that's a benefit to doing that.
So I've got just a couple of questions came up, and I alluded to this earlier. How hard do you think it would be with the data that you have, to get some estimated numbers on the storage costs for Mod 4? With Mod 4, with the cost being a large driver of it rocketing up the rankings, it seems like trying to capture the entirety of that, what that cost would actually be, would be pretty important to understand. Do you feel like we have enough data to try and wrap our heads around what those storage costs may be?
I sure think we could do that. Yeah.
Seems like we would. I mean, we know what the flows are. We know when we have the usage patterns. We know when that would happen. And so I think we could at least get an estimate on that. I think it would just be interesting to see because that would be a necessary component of that system. It seems like that would be a critical data gap to have that added and then see how that then plays out as far as the cost is concerned.
Yeah.
Follow up question to that one, Robin, because my understanding is modified 4 is a direct use option.
Yeah.
Right. So you're not actually strong, right?
Right. Yeah.
Well, just maybe a little bit of storage for
your temporary day-to-day storage, right?
When we have the volume coming in versus when we're using the water would be what I'd be interested in. And so if we're offsetting our pumping just directly, you just have your stores necessary for the treatment process. And that's, I guess that's what, is that included in the numbers that were estimated? The treatment from the treatment
It's the same
process
treatment,
stuff?
I think, because whether it's injected or it's direct use, it's the same treatment in water tanker.
Yeah.
So I guess my argument then would be that the numbers that we have are actually accurate. Your intake would be essentially a rain collector, which is a direct connection going to the store.
And then you'd have to see what controls to not pump as much. Or,
Yeah.
So
you are obviously doing direct use, not in the summer though, which is when you need the most. But I guess the argument towards aquifer is you're pumping less at the end of the year.
I guess what I mean is like, as we look at the usage numbers for when I suspect that we could consume all the water that we would be taking off.
Not yet. So I did look at that because
So
I was
that's-
really
yeah, that's what I
curious.
mean,
Yeah,
yeah.
so it's I did that for every direct use
Mm.
one, and it's kind of a difficult concept to wrap your head around, and there are some assumptions that need to go in there, but assuming, okay, this is the rate of, your 1% increase in population, this would be your 1% increase in use, at what point can you use all that water? And
Yeah.
I can tell you, I don't know off the top of my head, but I can give you when that would.
Because the alternative for that, I guess, would just be accepting that we wouldn't be able to use all of it at certain points of the year, and we send it down the creek until we hit that point, or we look at the storage and say, okay, it's worth it because it's gonna take 25 years to reach
Right.
that use point, and then it's
Right.
worth storing for that period of
Like
time. So
planting
that's-
creek, it's a long time before we would be able to use all that.
I suspect it's a lot lower with Southport.
Yeah.
That's true, yes, because Pullman uses more, so,
I
yeah.
think, and with alternative 4 modified, I would suspect it would be a lot lower.
Yeah.
So I think we'd be close, but that would be interesting to.
As long as we're not
Maybe during the break.
over, I guess it depends on distribution and where your treatment system is placed, how you're tying it into your distribution system, but seems like you definitely, I guess, a next step for that alternative is certainly playing with those numbers a little bit and finding out when I'm pulling, I don't know how many CFS is proposed, but what volume of water am I getting and what is my water use at that time? That's kind of what the question
that's
is. And
exactly.
are we over that water use? Because then we can't use all of that.
Right, and then at what point could we, if we're not?
During the break, I might have that.
Okay.
I actually wonder a little bit if we don't get too caught up in the weeds on the direct use piece versus the aquifer storage and recovery. I mean, it seems like you're pulling from the same point, you're probably gonna be pulling whatever amount you can get of water right for at some point. And I feel like some of those logistics you could probably work through as you start through the permitting process. And because I actually feel like we've gotten different opinions. I don't know if it was when we went down to Lewiston for the IDWR meeting down there, and I actually got the impression that they actually kind of like the aquifer storage and recovery. I know from a public standpoint, people get a little bit weary about that, but there are lots of places that do that successfully.
One follow-up question with aquifer storage and recovery, obviously you got to find the right location to inject and then you will pull it back out, and you're looking for coming back up in the subsurface, right? Where it's not leaking out, it's not finding places.
Right,
There's an unknown there of, how hard is it to find that whole scenario?
I think it would definitely require some research into that and probably some pilot tests. But since other places have done it, I mean, Walla Walla, there's lots of other areas. And so really, I think following what they did, kind of their investigations, and then knowing the geology that we do, we're learning. I think we've come a long way with that, especially having John Bush and, the model and having the discussions that have been had just because of that model could really help with that.
Well, I think SR is being used really successfully other places, but just be aware it's not a 1-for-1. For the water you put in, the water you pull out, it's not drop to drop.
Right.
Yeah.
Which
So
is
you're
why
pulling
our
out less
direct
than you
use is
put in.
appealing too.
As long as it's not foregone conclusion that either one is the right solution. If it's kind of, the solution is kind of one and the same, the costs are similar. As long as we clearly note that, hey, we gotta figure out, are we gonna do direct use or some more?
Right, and I do think that's a benefit to modify 4 is that you can make that decision. You don't have to make it right now. That can be something that still gets vetted out and discussed.
Or one could be direct use and one could be aquifer storage. and
Right.
recovery, yeah, depending on what your technical findings show. And, maybe injecting it in Moscow is advantageous. It depends on the state laws, because it's further up in the system. I don't know. I'm sort of making that up right there, but.
No, but that makes sense, yeah, where you put it in.
I mean, I guess I get a little less, so alternative 3 and alternative 4, in terms of the Washington side, both are talking about an intake and water treatment plant off the South Fork. While it's obviously going to make a difference on how much water volume you get off of it and when you're using it, your permitting is planning a lot. I mean, it does change obviously with aquifer storage and recovery, but it's a good starting point. Like if we decide as a group that alternative, maybe I'm not wrong, alternative 3 and alternative 4 modified makes sense, in some ways for parts of that, there's some overlap.
Yes.
So you can kind of continue to carry a couple of them along a little bit. Maybe you have to pick one and focus on that, but if you get through the permitting and something comes up that's a big deal breaker, you still have potential to sort of shift.
So is it possible to, with the modified 4, because we know kind of what our baseline pumping is outside of the irrigation season. And if we have more water in the South Fork than we can use, can we also divert into ASR? Do direct use and a little ASR?
Oh.
I mean, because if you're gonna get permitted, I mean, why not get permitted for the full amount?
Right.
Even if you don't use it, you can, bank it.
Oh, that's interesting.
But
So when
you have to treat it for sure.
well, either way you're treating.
Yeah,
There may be operational advantages to having a plant that runs consistent demand.
Well, there are a couple of different permitting pathways on the Washington side, whether you're gonna be storing it and within the reservoir permit, you're gonna pull from later on. Or if you're just gonna be diverting and treating and using it. So those are two separate permitting pathways.
Okay,
Yeah.
not a, well, that's good.
Right, and I think too, eventually when you get, 40 years out, you will be using all that water when you have it available, theoretically. So then maybe you would be spending that additional cost for recharge when later you wouldn't.
Yeah.
I don't know, although maybe you decide you need more water later and, I don't know, I guess something to think about.
And all this assumes that forever, the per capita use is gonna go down 15%.
I don't think it'll continue. I think it's just a reduction of 50% from the 2015 use. It wouldn't continue to go down.
No.
Just
a straight
15%.
Yeah.
So from 2015.
From 2015.
Of course, you're gonna have growth that continues, so.
Yeah.
Not 2015, I don't think we're 15% out.
Maybe if our animal gets that'd be a pretty big chunk.
It seems like we're trying to pick between 4 alternatives and we don't, we have some tendencies to lean towards one or another, but when you have a difficult choice like this, it's often simpler to eliminate one at a time that you don't think is
That's a
suitable.
good idea.
We may want to back up and just say, okay, which one don't we want to pursue?
Or focus on like Robin's recommendation that, 1 and 3 are kind of similar, decided one of those can be knocked off in comparison, because you had compared those two.
I think that's easier path for us to follow than to see which one do you guys want? It's simpler to start working in a way.
Yeah, I mean, so that is a question. Do we feel like the recommendation 3 over 1, do we feel strongly that seems to be the right approach?
No, I don't.
So that's fine. That's why we
I
have
mean,
this discussion.
so again, just full disclosure, I've been having some conversations with our resource planning department about pump storage. It is now a viable renewable energy generation source that we're putting into our integrated resource planning. It's not cheap. I mean, it's still really expensive, but it's at least on our planning horizon window. So what I'm asking for in the 2023 budget is some funding for feasibility to look at a site.
And I think that as far as that goes, were it not for that, I would agree that 1 could be eliminated in favor of 3, but if there's a potential partner that could be putting significant resources into that, that would change even our ranking significantly because cost was the biggest detriment to that and supply was up there. So I think that would completely change the dynamics if that were to happen.
My one other argument with that one too, I know in our matrix, we have that alternative as 85% reliable, but I think you could probably, it's a huge water source, and if you can get the water rights with it and you're working through it, there's probably potential with an added cost to get it to 100% reliability, right? I know that wasn't how we.
That's a bigger bucket, but it's got some of probably the biggest political dynamics, right? Yeah, from a fisheries recovery to dam breaching to,
Where crossings.
but at the same time, the supply is there.
Yeah. One of the things that I wanted to discuss too is just with the two options that were initially discussed is the preferred options. Is just taking a look and ensuring, since both of those include the use on each side of the state border, no water crossing the state line. I think that as far as public acceptability of the project, making sure that we have some level of parity between the investment that's being made on each side of the state so that not one set of ratepayers are disproportionately burdened with stabilizing the aquifer.
3 is hard though. I think 3 puts more on the Idaho side.
Yeah, certainly, the Flanagan, and especially with 3, there's a really just, so that, I mean, the advantage obviously of the bigger project across the state lines is it becomes sort of a regional thing that both sides contribute to proportionately. Whereas with, for example, 3, there's a pretty disproportionate cost associated with that. So I just think that's something we have to keep in mind as we move forward.
Well, the same ones, modified option 4 is pretty good. Because it's
fairly balanced,
but it also allows Pullman to develop a project, it allows Moscow to develop a project, at about the same cost, same flow rate, so.
So what you're suggesting, modified 4 should be moved forward.
When I look at the numbers from the matrix, I asked the question, okay, what's the question? Does this make sense? And as I did that, it actually does make a lot of sense. I think when we go back and look at option 1, for example, that one still, it doesn't make sense to me because we put such a high value on reliability and that political piece that Paul's talking about, I think bumps that number down a bit. But when I looked at, our criteria for 4, for example, it was there.
One of the things I always try to remember is I think it's easy as we look at these to think of this in terms, especially with the runway that has been in place for trying to get a project on the ground, that we look at these as we get one of these alternatives done. It's like, oh, wow, we solved the water problem. And no, this is a 50-year horizon. Right? I mean, there'll be people in this room to start working on that, whatever that next one is, which is likely to be another one of these. So I don't think that it precludes looking at some of this other stuff in the future either.
Like mitigation steps instead of solution steps. So that can take mitigating some part of the problem.
Well, and exactly along those lines, in option 3, you've got that second step of Flanagan Creek and all the storage associated with that. So that could be a very good long-term option. That's the back that Tyler's talking about. But the other thing that we don't have a totally solid handle on is how much we can get out of water conservation. So if we do a water supply project now, with some of these interim steps in modified 4, and then see how much we can get out of water conservation, we can push off that Flanagan Creek work a long way.
Probably with the minimum stream flow claims that have been placed by the tribe through the adjudication process, I imagine that would have an impact on the Flanagan Creek alternative as well. Now, obviously, we don't know how that's going to go through, but with that in place, I think that's certainly a consideration as we look at that.
And Paradise, anything that.
All
really.
Yeah, actually North Fork as well.
Yeah.
Which makes it snake.
Well, and that, I mean, adjudication process would be pretty long, but that, I don't, over the next few years, we'll likely get a lot more clarity.
We'll know what the Police River adjudication, probably, I'd say within a year. Maybe Michelle has a little more insight on where that adjudication's at and where the tribal claim process is too.
Yeah, I was talking internally to our adjudication folks this morning, and a 1 to 2 year time frame is an ideal time frame. That is not the expected time frame. Some of these negotiations, as you know, take longer when things stall out. So it's just hard to predict if there would be any kind of stall out. But negotiations have begun between the tribes and the state and the parties. So that's a good sign.
That's good.
Good. Thank you.
But it could affect all the projects. The tribes have claims on each of the surface water bodies that are in question.
Yeah. And I do want to say, I mean, the tribe's been very good about wanting to engage with PBAC and recognizing, they recognize the efforts that we're engaged in and have expressed the desire to engage with us and be cooperative as we go through that process. But it is something we'll have to see how that shakes out, because that could have a big influence.
So are there any, we haven't talked at all hardly about alternative two, maybe with Mark's comment. Because there's a lot there to think about. And so is there one of these alternatives that we say, okay, we're okay putting that last? It doesn't mean that any of these are just going away. It just means moving forward with these. And again, these are just recommendations. This is not, these still have to go back to the entities and get public feedback and all those things. So it's just narrowing things down.
So Robin, maybe you can provide a little more insight on conversations with fisheries on North Fork, South Fork, and their concerns. They seem much more concerned about minimum flows, the habitat on South Fork and North Fork of the Palouse than they did on the Snake River.
Yeah.
By far. Which is kind of like,
yeah, it was a little bit surprising.
Mhm, that's what I see, Paul. Yeah, well, I had a brief chat with Dave earlier today, and this is, like Paul said yesterday, we better get ready to make some big boy decisions here. I think messing around with our surface water on the South Fork and the North Fork and Flanagan, boy, I just don't see that on a 100-year timeline. I've been here 50 years. I think of the changes that have been in this community over 50 years. I came here as a freshman. And some of these just look like Band-Aids to me compared to what our community was 50 years ago when I first came here and where we're going to be in 50 years. I think some of the philosophical questions, and if I'm completely out of line, just say, go away. Are we looking at, we want a region with 100,000 population, or are we looking at a region with 500,000 population? And I think in my mind, there's a lot of really unanswered questions out there. I think messing around with surface water and surface creeks, I think that's a quality of life issue, not just for the fish, but for all of us. And in terms of recreation dollars, which are clean and green, that come into our area and will be very much more important in the future. As Governor Schweitzer from Montana used to say, they finally learned that the gold wasn't in the mountain, that the gold was the mountain. And maybe we're not taking enough of that. That's way too philosophical out there. Like I say, just go ahead and shut me down. But I'm looking at more like a 100-year timeline and that regional. We can say Washington, we can say Idaho, we can say this and that and the other thing, but we're looking at this regional. I'm looking at it very much regional. And are we gonna build a Panama Canal, or are we gonna be mall?
Yeah, I think in my, kind of Mark's comments, in the attempt to eliminate kind of being easier than choosing, I would say alternative two, I think is the least likely. I think that from where I'm sitting and what we've discussed and looked at this point, it seems like I think our best bet is to proceed with alternative 4 as a recommendation, and that we start the vetting process, data gap filling, start the process of working on that, knowing that we have 3 and 1, that there are conditions that could change that could make them far more viable and feasible. And so because the reason I think that may be wise is like a lot of, especially the short runway provisions in alternative 4 are things that we want to do anyway, like promoting additional conservation, looking at some, they're not huge investment infrastructure stuff. And so I think that we can really rapidly start that process of the additional conservation, tracking that stuff, starting to do some of the engineering on the other components of that plan, which would give us time for adjudication to shake out, and then future energy needs in the region to shake out, which to me are 2 massive questions that we need answered in order to understand the feasibility of some of those way higher dollar amount projects like Flanagan or like the Snake River version. And so we get clarity on that, but we're not stagnating in that process. And it gives us a runway to be working on something that then we could pivot if either of those things become apparent that we ought to.
So I really hate to agree with you, Tyler.
Careful, don't do it often. It's a bad idea.
Taking the premise. He's kind of reflecting about where I'm at right now too. And it's not like I'm solid on any given one here, but I think the modified 4 would be my preference, but not forgetting 1 and 3. I agree too. I think it's our least preferable. So there you go, Tyler. I think
I'm gonna make a plan. Who knows how to cross stitch?
We'll never hear it again.
I got a crayon.
One of the things I think we may be able to see with some very aggressive conservation, which I think we need to commit to in our municipalities and universities, is we may see some response in the aquifer levels sooner than not. And that may be really surprising and encouraging. But again, that's an unknown as well, but I just think that's an easy way to see if the aquifers will respond and will stabilize.
Those alternative conservation measures though are only in 4 and modified 4. They're not listed in 1, 2,
And I
3.
think technically we would continue doing those.
I think they're factored in as like a 1% conservation.
I don't think they.
I mean,
Well, I
they're
am a
listed
little-
at $20 million.
I am a little interested in diving into those a little bit, because it was pointed out at a meeting, I think it's $53 million for conservation is what's listed for that, but what was the basis of that $53 million? I know that was what was in the Anchor QBA report, but was that, what were we spending $53 million on for the conservation piece? I don't know. I mean, AMI is kind of expensive. That's a big one that would go a long ways towards it, but it's not $53 million expensive.
Yeah, I don't know. I looked into their report because I know that they referenced the conservation plans, but it did not add up. Plus it's different because you're looking at different dollar amounts of different years. And so the
Over a
next
different
person
time.
brings up to, the current dollar, but
It's hard to do it if you don't establish something. But I guess what I'm saying is you may see more aggressive conservation without having to spend as much money as in alternative 4, 53 million. Yeah, we may be able to do it for less.
At some point, we have to do some work to
Yes.
substantiate the cost basis of whichever one we pursue.
Mhm.
And I think you're gonna have to get into some of the nuts and bolts.
Right.
Not to mention our recent inflation and what that might do to all of these. But I think if we did pick 4, for example, we would want more of a plan of what that looks like.
Yeah, and are we doing something, a unified approach? Maybe we try and come to some sort of agreement, with everybody. So, I know we have different things going on in different places, so. We'll obviously have to establish a plan around any of these alternatives.
And I think that approach, it gives us a way, the risk that we run with our state entities, I think, is we don't want to give the perception that, oh yeah, we're just kicking the can down the road again. Like that's something I think we need to show improvement with. But I think that this would give us the ability to do that, with in the governor's budget for the state of Idaho, there's money for planning this year's budget for continuing this process. And so I think that it gives us some productive routes to have those funds. But I do think that it's the 2 things that we really need answered, being the energy piece and the adjudication piece. It's not like those are like, oh, well, someday we'll have the answer to that. These are both things that are critical and crucial, but they have a shorter term horizon that we will have answers to that. Obviously, the adjudication being the one that we hope is 2 years, maybe longer, but I would imagine that even on the power and the energy side, we're looking in the next couple of years, we would know if there's momentum coalescing around that option. So
I want to circle back to conservation because I want to share with you. So when we have our water summit, John, Kimberly and I always drive our keynote around the neighborhood. And since the Anchor QEA report, we would take them on a tour and show them the different alternatives and sources. And I remember taking Sandra Postel, who's the National Geographic Water Fellow, to the top of Elmo to Grade, and I just, we just stopped up there down at the lower Granite Dam pool. And I said, well, this is one of our alternatives. And she looked over, she goes, oh, honey, you have a lot of conservation to do before you ever ask your taxpayers to go there.
Yeah.
She called me honey.
She's from the south. She's from the south. That's okay.
I know she didn't.
You call me from the south.
Another quick question, with the fisheries folks expressing concern with modified 4, do we have any idea when the timing of that decision or feedback would be?
Actually, I'm going to talk about that a little bit later in our discussion. We can talk about that more.
It seems like, you know, until we dive into a detailed design towards something and really start spending some money towards diving into some of these things, we're not gonna have the answers that they're gonna want. And, you know, it's just gonna keep being an idea that sounds like a grand idea. So Tyler's.
So
correct.
Tyler, oh, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
What you're saying is modified 4 can act as a conduit to build upon moving forward. Because this is a great path to begin with. That could lead to a branch off of 1 or 3 to build out more opportunity as situations change or present themselves.
I think what I'm saying is that if we come away saying we're going to focus our energies on modified 4, that's what we're going to do. And then prioritizing within modified 4, because it is on each side of the state, it is conservation heavy. So focusing our priorities strategically on what we can get on the ground rapidly that we know, regardless of where we may pivot, is still productive, like the conservation piece, to be working and continue forward momentum, but give ourselves some time also so that we get some clarity on a couple items that could necessitate a pivot toward 1 or 3. And so then once we have that information clarified, the 2-3 years won't be wasted time because we're still maintaining momentum, we're working towards something. But then we still have the ability to pivot effectively towards something else.
Now,
Just for what it's worth, my sitting here looking at these, I agree on option 2, option 2, that on some level kind of the most clunky. But
Uncertain. I like that technical term.
But alternative 3 is kind of not too far behind that in some ways. I worry that any time where we're reaching a good distance from these 2 communities to get to water, Snake River to me seems like an entirely different kind of animal than it is if we're taking water from Tremont, flooding a creek or intake and pollutants. You know, I think we'd be less likely to encounter the, hey, that's my water kind of discussion. And if both of those are the ones where, if we are going to share water across the state lines, it seems like the Snake River solution, it was kind of with the modified alternative 4, you've got a pretty much community level alternative there. And then you've got the brute force alternative on alternative 1. So you kind of got the spectrum covered there. I don't know, 2 and 3 are the ones that are at the bottom of my list.
It's funny, the engineer in me loves 1. They'll spend a lot of money.
Yeah. Right.
Build something big and awesome.
Yeah.
Just have the need for the water, right? But I understand that's not this.
Sure. Well, it isn't, right?
Right.
We know there's a lot of water over there. We just need really big pipes, really big pumps, and off we go.
Well, yeah, it was interesting. I think some of the conversations that we've had, even with the guy from ecology, as he worked on some of the projects and looking at all of our projects, including our most expensive being alternative 1. When you looked at the per acre foot cost compared to some of the projects that have taken place elsewhere, even in the state of Washington, it's still pretty cheap water. Yeah, I mean, compared to, I'm not trying to poo-poo a huge project, but when you look at some of the, you look at some of the stuff you're trying to do for the Great Salt Lake right now, it's just mind blowing. And so like, really by comparison, we're lucky that we have this many alternatives that may be feasible with relatively cheap water.
We have a lot of water, it's just not in all the right places. That's our problem. All we're talking about is how to get it to a place we can use it.
And we're not having to take it nearly as far as a lot of communities are really having to take water.
So I've had some conversation with Robin. I've sent pictures of Flanagan Creek, you know, during different seasons of the year. And I'm just questioning that supply. It just doesn't look like it's there. And again, full disclosure, that's my neighborhood. It's Jeannie's neighborhood, and I'm just looking like, man, that's a tiny little stream, and I just don't see that. And I know water resources, they love to build reservoirs. And I know, right, Michelle? They love to build reservoirs.
Oh.
So.
Oh, yes, I would love that. I think
It's not
the
because
dam
of
safety engineer in me loves that option. Just because it would have a reservoir that allows you to offset peak hourly demand and get through, the peak heat of summer and peak usage and still have a pretty regular supply as long as your source is there. The one thing that hit me about modified alternative 1 in the report was the report indicated it was the option that had the lowest reliability of water availability. So that caught my attention. And is there a way to measure those surface water bodies to get at that pretty quickly before you get too far down modified alternative 4?
Yeah, I think there's definitely some next steps that would happen based on these. We don't have that information. We don't know what the flows are in Atlantic. There is a stream gauge on South Fork, Palouse,
North Fork. It was.
Fork
We were
and
paying
Paradise
for
Creek.
that.
And some of that was investigated, but there's definitely still some of those next steps to see, is this really a viable source?
Actually, crunch some
Yeah.
pretty big numbers.
Right.
And I agree with Paul in that variability. You look at I was just mentioning Paul last night, that I know where there's just south of Pullman, there's 2 really large retention ponds, really large. And this time last year, they were puddles. And this year, they are above the historic high water mark. So that shows you how widely things, and of course, we're talking about the wildlife moves back in like crazy. Any given day, you find a coyote or that, and it's amazing how fast that happens. But it also can happen fast in the negative direction too. I mean, we had 2 years where those were way, way down. Even in the middle of the winter, they were way, way down. So that's extremely variable. And again, I mean, maybe nature can take care of itself in that regard, and maybe it's messing with them a little too much. Doesn't benefit any of us.
Worry about climate change and other things and the impacts that can have on 2 or 3, possibly 4 also.
All of them.
And we could be rivers more wonderful.
Well, yeah, I mean, we're looking at, who knows what could happen too. Again, if I'm getting way out there, we're looking at the possibility of climate refugees in this, that could spike our, when a friend of mine started talking about this 10 years ago, I thought it was that big. Well, he isn't that big, but what he has said about this has come to pass. And as we look at our agriculture, I'm a foodie, so I relate everything back to food. We grow a lot of food in this part of the world. But what we don't grow is, well, more than what you think, maybe, what we don't grow is a lot of protein. So if we're looking at markets in Texas and in Oklahoma and Nebraska, their cattle markets, they're not gonna be able to raise cattle. These weather trends conditions continue. They're not gonna be able to raise cattle. They're not gonna be able to raise hogs or chickens there. So where is that protein source for the masses going to go? It's gonna come north. I already know several horse trainers, world-class horse trainers that have moved out of Texas. They're gone. I mean, they've closed up 1,000-acre operations because they've had to move north because it's unsustainable with the climate being the way it is. Again, that could change at any time, maybe this is just a blip, but we need to look at the long picture of where the agriculture is gonna go. And if they're gonna keep pulling pivots and putting in more pivots, boy, God bless the child who's got his own, and we got our own. We just need to figure out what we need to do.
Yeah, ask for beyond the reliability question for modified 4. Do you know how climate change was taken into account, or was it?
It was not, but I do know, I think Washington State and Ecology, they come up with a study that we're looking at the effects of climate change in the future. And I used to keep a slide just for that question, and I didn't keep it in this one, but I think it was more the timing of the water, not that there would be less water. It would pour more as rain, less as snow.
I think it was, if I recall, it was a net increase in total precipitation, but the net evaporation was also up.
That's
right. So
it cancels out.
I think
so it depends on your ability to be resilient for the seasonal difference.
I think Eileen hit on it, but climate change here probably won't affect the supply as much as it will the demand. And I think that's what we need to kind of keep in mind. I think demand will go faster than you think.
Yeah, I mean, this region is projected to be one of the top regions for climate migration, so it's something to consider.
That's where I think it'll impact us the most. There will be small changes in how any individual stream runs or when the rain hits, but I don't think there's a reduction in the amount of water we'll have. It just might be in different places.
Yeah, so the best mitigation strategy then is basically to get some form of storage, whether it's in the summer or surface
storage is what it is. That's where we're.
Yeah, so kind of where I was going with that is the storage is the big shock absorber.
That's true.
Storage is expensive.
Well, that, I think it just circles back to my question about flowing storage for now precipitation. If we're doing first events that that it overwhelms our ability to treat, and that's when we have to take the water and it shifts the amount we have to take when we have to take it, that could impact the storage considerations for that.
Even with the scenario where the dam would reach, so there's that system got a lot of aggregate storage.
Yes.
Right. That's a different.
It doesn't go, but it does change.
But I was gonna ask one other question. Do you have surface storage? Was thrown in the mix at all for like the South Fork, the Blues and Paradise withdrawals?
I don't think there's any storage.
But I mean, I know there wasn't, but I was wondering if in previous iterations there was any discussion of, off-channel surface storage or anything.
I don't think there was.
I think some time ago, we talked about passive recharge. So we kind of identified areas where we just let them flood along Clyde Park area or something. So,
yeah. That was remember curious where we discussed that.
I think that works better in most areas.
It's maybe, I mean, that's what's that latest study that we had done with the seismographs, was that's what it was trying to get at, is to see where we may have an opportunity for that, and seem to identify, we don't have any great alternatives for that, like they do, up in Coeur d'Alene or down in Lewiston, but at least we got a better idea for where we might see some passive recharge.
Robin, did they look at evaporative loss on the reservoir, Flanagan Creek? Did you guys look at that at all, or what the estimated loss might be?
I'm not sure. We didn't specifically, we really just took what Anchor had done and what they took what somebody else had done. So
I'm just curious, thinking about that, what that might be.
I don't remember if that, I don't remember if that was a golden. Was it golden? I think it was golden. No, maybe it was SPF. I don't know. I don't recall if that was in the original.
So, kind of back to the original question, is the group kind of considering that option 2 is probably not in our better interest at the moment? Can we say that's a low hanging fruit that we're touching on?
I think it sounds like we're in agreement on that.
We've accomplished something.
Yep.
Anyone want to speak
That's monumental. It's been 4 for a long time.
That's good.
It's not off the list, it's just our least preferred at the moment.
Yeah.
And
We had a kid move out of the house.
I say. That just be, they take it off.
And start
It'll
And then
come
I guess
there.
with that, I think in the last meeting, we talked about replacing modified 4 with 4, but are you in agreement to also not move alternative 4 forward?
I mean, you never know what can happen if something comes up with wastewater use or technologies change or something, you can come back to look at those, but my personal opinion, there's other issues with like Pullman wastewater reuse, and that's a lot of the water that goes into the South Fork is from the wastewater treatment plant. And I don't have confidence that we'll even be able to not discharge as much as we probably should. So
Yeah.
even the high number, I think you're probably not. So I'm okay with it.
And you're not consumptive use in Washington, so you guys are required to discharge a certain amount, right?
I don't know that, but.
I just know there was a lot of, when WSU, and I wasn't involved with that at the time, and the city actually put forth somewhat of a 30% design effort. There was a lot of pushback about, hey, we don't even know that you guys can stop discharging.
It's a water rights question that we need to answer.
Yeah.
So it got a lot of pushback.
And I know Washington Fish and Wildlife, they didn't support that.
Yeah.
You look at the amount of water that's coming in South Fork and Cedar and Colfax,
Not right now.
Yeah.
I'll bet all of that's our district right now.
Yeah, I mean, that's, yeah, Moscow's flows from our reclamation facility is Paradise Creek during certain points of the summer.
Yeah. So, I wouldn't say never, this technology isn't going to change. But my opinion is probably to drop that one.
Yeah, I wouldn't argue for keeping it. I don't see the merits in keeping it.
And that's which option again?
Option
Four, not
modified.
original orders, four.
How are we doing on time?
We have until 2:30, which I think we're checking on figures.
Oh, okay.
You can talk until we get through.
Um,
But we just got 2 off the list, so it's good.
What is can I see what our next agenda items are?
We have discussion.
So now you found
We take one step back, now take 2 steps forward.
So we could just break right now since we just got 2 off the deck.
I think everybody's ready.
Break or break?
Well, hold on, I'm gonna circle back real quick. I wanna jump back to 3. Sounds like I heard talk for a while about people moving away from 3, but maybe now we're not sure about moving away from 3. That's what I'm hearing. I just wanna circle back on that one.
I see the challenge I see to 3 is the inequity between costs on each side of the border. I mean, one of the things that had long been, I guess, one of the items that had pushed 4-3 was that a lot of the preliminary feedback that we got from the Division of Water Resources on the Idaho side was a preference for that project because they really like the storage component of that and building storage. And so they thought that that was something that would be easier to fund. And then obviously just the quantity of water that was projected to be available there. But if it came down to, if we got the question answered about the power component of 1, I think that then that is clearly a better alternative than 3. If there's going to be a major investment by the utility, and then there's the ability to shoot for that big project, I think that's a more feasible big project than building the reservoir on Moscow Mountain. Just my own personal take on it.
And I do think we can get past that equitability hurdle just by, working on, okay, here's the value of water, each of the entities, and then we would all, we would balance. So I think we can make it work too. It's just as more challenging.
I think given the reliability of 3, and since there's unknowns about the fisheries with modified 4, I'm gonna keep it at 6 for next a little longer.
Yep.
10
So
minutes? Should we start back at 3:30?
2:30?
Okay. Start back at 3:30.
We're gonna take a break. Those at home watching.
Yeah, talk about all the
It's
systems.
so funny to see myself on the side.
Okay, we passed 3:30, so.
Yeah, we got a little carried away. I think we're still on track.
Do you want us?
Stop your talking, Paul.
Bar card, just have beer.
That makes
Really good.
Oh, no, the rest of that was okay. You can tell they're pretty brief.
Okay, I think we have a little bit of a lull in the room here. Thanks for your patience over there in virtual world. Robin's gonna jump in and lead some discussion items, but I didn't realize it's a little harder for you folks there in virtual world to potentially get our attention. So I wanted to open up the opportunity to anyone out there. If you guys had any questions or comments or things that you wanted to add from the earlier discussion.
Oh, Daniel and I were just talking, and the matrix was a really huge project. And we're just wondering why the group doesn't go with the recommendation coming out of the matrix as a starting point.
It's a great question.
Well, I think we did. Isn't that what we decided on? I mean, the matrix recommendation was modified for, and that's what we went with.
But maybe in terms of 3 and 1,
Like
maybe more.
like I said, that's my question, is the follow-up ranking or? Oh, Sean, it seemed like the group consensus was in alignment with the recommendation from the matrix, which was the number 4 alternate.
Yeah, I think that's a good approach.
Like that.
If we are looking to do conservation anyway, that was a really good point.
I think, in past discussions, we've also struggled with how we rank the criterion in the matrix too. Do we give that a 10 as the most important? We've still struggled with some of that.
It's that quantitative, qualitative discussion, and there are some, Steve could give us all a wonderful, wonderful lesson. But it does add, I think, kind of the discussion at the beginning, when you said it and Tyler said it, you have to add some common sense into there too, so. But it is promising, I think, that modified alternative 4A does show up in the top ranking that it, in the one that it's included in. Good question, Michelle. Other thoughts from virtual world? Questions? Disagreements? Agreements? See.
Steve on there? Can we lose Steve?
Yeah, I just asked Steve how, if he's been able to hear us. He said Robin needs to speak up.
Oh, okay.
Just start yelling at us, okay?
All right.
Probably because I'm facing this way too.
Yeah. Anybody else at home before we move on?
All right.
Someday maybe there'll be a portal to share food.
I know, there is not. Okay, great. All right, so some discussion items. There are a number of discussion items here, and these are really, well, we'll go through them, and then if there's other things that you guys want to discuss, we can do that. So the idea is that we would have discussion items, talk about those, and then come back to a timeline in next steps where we really some of these, we may be able to have roles and responsibilities and develop a timeline. Other ones are, yeah, we'll come back to that. So anyway, that's just how the plan is to set this up. So the first item on the list is our contract. And that's really to say that I think it's been a great project, and we're actually like using up the last of our hours right here at this workshop. So it's worked out completely perfectly. We'll be able to obviously finish the workshop, and then we'll submit the final report. So I've already incorporated some comments on that. And what I'd like to do is to be able to incorporate what PBAC is looking for in the report, so that it's all included in one final document.
Will we encompass any of this discussion today in that, do you think? Or there's not in the report, like there won't be a paragraph or a summary?
No, I think there will be, yes, yeah. So I'd like to, I think, include the notes and then just have kind of a summary. And then even, what Alta recommended was alternative 4, modified 4, and alternative 3, then maybe we'll switch to recommendation. Because like I said, I was really kind of on the fence anyway. I think it would be nice to match what PBAC would like moving forward. So we'll be able to finish that. With that, we'd like to continue to helping you move forward with this project. And so a lot of these discussion items are what's coming up next, but you had looked to us to help you move this project forward. And so I think that we've been doing a good job with that, and we really enjoy doing that. And so we would propose to continue doing something like that. So I had met with Paul and Stanley, and we talked a little bit about it. And so, I don't think you need to necessarily make any decisions, but knowing that it might take a while depending on what needs to happen with the city of Moscow and, a contract extension, things like that. So we'll just kind of open that up for discussion.
Just from my perspective, we've known that, this wasn't, that the end of this wasn't this report, that's it's a continued process, that this is narrowing down so that we can focus efforts as we move forward. So I would personally be open to a discussion about some sort of extension of contract so we can continue the next steps that are upcoming. We're going to have the outreach both to the public, our SEG, to our elected officials, leadership of all the different bodies, and then just the continued work of narrowing down these alternatives as we go. As I mentioned, there's money in the state budget from the state of Idaho for continuation on this project. And so from a logistics standpoint, if there was a desire on the part of the committee to do that, it wouldn't be a terribly complicated process, depending on the quantity that we're looking at to extend the contract. I wouldn't need to establish a new contract. I don't think at this point we could extend just depending on the quantity. If we get into to the extent where the extensions are more than the original contract was, then I've got to do something different.
Yeah.
But at this point, I think that we could continue to work by extension of the existing contract.
I think when we talk through next steps and timeline, that'll help here. It sounds like it's coming in, but I would support it, and it's been really helpful having, Robin doing a lot of things behind the scenes while the rest of us are back doing our other jobs too, and your other jobs as well. But having somebody to kind of help us continue to move forward and make progress.
When we presented to the Water Resource Board in May, there was conversation about, hey, there's some funding. We'd like to put some money in your project. We're like, okay. So again, part of what I think we need to figure out is what could they fund? What could we fund more immediately? Around modified alternative 4. So it's one of the things I want us to kind of keep in mind too. Is that $10 million, 15, 20? I don't know. There's money out there.
So what we could do is, after we go through some of these next steps, and I could come up with, I guess kind of a cost estimate. And a lot of this is, it's meetings, it's outreach, and so it isn't just super straightforward, but then you can just have a dollar amount, and we just charge our time. It's time and materials. So
yeah, and I think it's important that we keep in mind that the next phase of this isn't hey, the committee decided alternate 4, let's start pursuing that. That's always been the fear of this committee, that it would appear that there was a bunch of technical experts that came out of the room and said, hey, yay, everybody, we solved it, we've got a solution. I think the next step is definitely that public outreach. Is that engaging with our elected, is that engaging with the community? Because the buy-in is the next step, not engineering the
Right,
process.
yeah.
And so I think that to me would be that next step, bridging piece that could help us get to the engineering piece.
I mean, y'all are smart, don't get me wrong, but yeah, we owe it to our public and our electeds to really engage now in a more meaningful way instead of, yeah, these crazy big ideas. Now it's like, okay, so tell us what you think. I mean, what are we missing? Just, again, we're at that point now where once we finalize this, I think that we've got to turn up the volume on our outreach.
Yeah, it's like you're setting up the discussion. Well, I guess you've seen them already.
The what?
All the next discussion items.
Yeah. Well, I helped you put those on there, didn't we? We didn't prioritize them. They're not in any kind of order.
Right, yeah. The only reason I number them is so if we want to go back and talk about them, we can talk about which number.
Yeah. I'll be quiet now.
The only thing I'd modify to what Paul said is, we want to find out what the public and the elected officials think, but I think we should still also say, here's what we think we should proceed. Here are some of the other alternatives, and not lose sight of what has transpired in this room and other rooms leading up to this.
I think that's
Just
important.
be real careful how you present it.
I think that's at the risk of continuing to agree with each other, Mark. I think. Wow.
Separate.
Twice.
One day.
I think that was
Go
our.
buy that lottery ticket.
I think that was our commitment to the public, to our electeds, to everybody, was that we would do that legwork to put some sideboards on the thing, to look at that level of technical feasibility, and then we would bring that forward for that discussion. So it's not just that, if we go back to them yet again saying, hey, here's 4 alternatives, we haven't done the work we said we were going to do. So I think it is presenting, hey, these are the 4 alternatives, this is the process we went through for vetting, and this is what we're recommending.
I can couch it correctly.
Yeah, at the risk of agreeing with both Mark and Tyler at the same time, which, anyway, we won't chase that.
It's getting
But
scary now.
It is. But I like that what Mark said was careful, and what Tyler said, sideboards, because if it's like, it's like you get your kids up in the morning and if you want, you get to ask them what kind of cereal they want, and you list off Cheerios, you give 18 choices and you never get a decision made.
Yeah.
So that's where we have to be really careful, especially in Pullman, where this has been off and on kind of a hot button thing. There's been a lot of stuff thrown up into the air and that has not been helpful, is to have a very clear message of this is how we got there and this is where we're at. Because Pullman has a tendency to want to loop back and reinvent the wheel every single time. We haven't had, look at Kara's face. Yeah. We have a real negative history of that, and pretty soon we're inch deep and a mile wide and we're nowhere.
Yeah.
And that's a real concern in Pullman. And so, yeah, have the alternatives, whatever we gin up here, and have it absolutely sparkling clear and a few words as to how we got here. Because if you give them, again, if you give them too much, they'll go, well, why didn't you do this? Or why didn't you do that? Or why didn't you do this? Some of it's going to be somewhat legitimate too, but we can't do everything. It's like when you go on a tour of Rome, you can't see absolutely everything. But yeah, Pullman is kind of the tricky element here, and we have to be very careful and very clear, or else we.
And I think more, Robin is suggesting to, Alta can help do some of that work to develop that messaging further and continue to, we can lay out what that maybe looks like, but.
So we are taking, if somebody wants a beverage.
Right, okay, so everyone's open to the idea that we'll come up with some kind of an estimate, kind of a scope of what we would propose to do.
Is that really we could bring to the next meeting for discussion?
I would.
Do you need something sooner? You don't need.
I guess.
End of August, expires the end of August.
So, I mean, it's not a terribly complicated thing for me to get in front of the council. Just gotta look at our agenda, I'll take it to committee and council, so there will be just a 2 week process, depending on where the rotation hits, and so it'll no more than a month to get something through. So if we're wanting to have that something in place by the time the current contract expires, then I need something for you.
I mean, I can come up with something in the next couple of days. And then, I don't know if you guys can make any decisions via email or if you have to have a meeting.
Well, this would require
research
funding, so it
for
would be
the
the
research
for
funders.
research funding entities that we need to vote. I don't think our bylaws require that to be in a meeting. I think it just has to be of the vote of all 4 research funding entities. So I could potentially take it, I could go through on the 8th, I could take it to committee on the 15th to council of August, but I would have to have an approved something that I could then attach by the previous Wednesday, so the 3rd of August, so next Wednesday.
So we're talking a scope of work.
Some sort of scope of work and a dollar amount.
So we can do basically like a supplemental or
Ratify.
extend probably the contract time with an addition of a cost. So it sounds like we could.
And if it was we could do, if the idea is assistance with public outreach, so there's not a specific task, it could just be a TNM not to exceed.
For now.
And that could bridge us until we have some more definition of what we need to do. So that might be a lot more simple, because then it would just be a matter of you guys doing some TNM costs, and we just have to establish a not to exceed number.
Okay.
Which that shouldn't be too complicated.
Yeah, and I think that's really what I see anyway, because I mean, it's hard to put boundaries on this. It's helping you move forward with it, it's helping to do the outreach. But it's really, I can come up with as much or as little as you want. And so it's, maybe you do just have a maximum in TNM rates and.
So the only thing just to keep in mind is that whatever we established as the maximum TNM rate is what the city would invoice PBAC for. And then we could refund a PBAC at the end if there was. I mean, I imagine that there'd be some future thing that we would add into and just continue to use with some of the things we contract. But that's what we just, so if it was, $15,000 not to exceed, we just invoice PBAC for $15,000. And once we had that in common, we execute the contract.
Yeah, and if it didn't get used,
then we get either refund it to PBAC or use it for whatever the next iteration of the thing is.
Do people feel comfortable authorizing? And we can, it sounds like via email, we can reach out to the 4 research entities once we have something. But while we have the whole group there, is there a number that people feel comfortable with?
Robin, did you say maybe 10,000? When we talked, I can't remember.
I don't think you really said, I mean,
So what's the
I
amount?
think 10 might be a little small, because the other thing too we want to talk about is a leadership roundtable. I guess I don't know, like,
I was
actually
thinking-
looking at the rates. Yeah.
I was thinking 50, but maybe that's a little crazy.
What was our original contract amount?
It was originally 150,
150.
and
And
then
we
we
did
did
an addition to it for around
200, I think.
They got us 200 total.
Budget report in a while.
We've got I think we still are over 400,000 balance in a research budget.
Maybe like 25, I don't know, just as a starting point, you can always come back.
I mean, that'd buy us some time.
It's also that gives us a little more time to revisit the budget.
Research right now is at 260.
260.
But I'm not sure what else is that number.
I think we're okay. Is everybody laying?
Yeah.
Might be a few else.
I think that's the only other outstanding is, and the modeling, WSU modeling, okay.
I see this as one of the most important aspects of what we've done so far. I mean, this has all been great, and I like sitting in the room with engineers. That's my life anyway. So now we're.
I'm not sure what to make of that.
You don't know my husband and his family, yeah, okay. So as Mr. Spockman said, this is now in the purview of the diplomats. This is the next phase. This is the most important thing that we are faced with, or challenged with, the next task. So I like Paul's number of 50. If we don't spend it, we don't spend it.
I guess I would agree, I agree with Eileen that something that Kara said when she was introducing this, I think is critical for all of us to keep in mind is that we've all got day jobs and we need somebody championing this thing or it will stagnate. And at this point, we can't allow the stagnation because there's been so much anticipation built up about this report and about what's happening here. And we can't afford to have that fall flat in the phase that's the most crucial phase, which is rolling this out to our public and our electeds. And so I think now is not the time for us to pull back. I mean, I don't want to be reckless, but I think it's important that we really get this piece right. And then we have somebody championing this piece that it is something that they're able to focus on, which none of us are going to be able to do. Time requirement to actually do it right.
I have 3 people who are out. And again, we can put something together and prepare, but I just want to make sure that we have a good feeling coming out of the committee before we send out. We can send that out to everybody and then ask the researchers.
Yeah, and then we give me a chance to run that by my legal and just make sure they're comfortable with that dollar amount within the confines of the current contract, which I suspect they will, but then we give me a chance to do that and we can circle back on it.
Okay, I'm not hearing any complaints, so we'll kind of run with that for now.
Well, and with the idea that that's a not to exceed. So if we don't end up needing that, we don't need it, and it comes back.
And the only thing I would add to that is if we could look at a good scope and then modify from there. We can start at 50, but I think you really do need to look at that scope because we may decide we need to go for a little bit more.
All right,
Just
I will.
keeps the momentum going.
Yeah. Yeah.
We've got good momentum. Good rolling.
One of the good use of saline too. in this area.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure what the right mechanism is to get saline in the mix and up to speed but
Yeah.
don't forget that asset down there too.
Yeah.
Keep also on.
You'll be involved still very heavily, I'm sure. Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, next item, great. Okay, final report submittal date. So I think probably the next week or 2, that I'll be able to get that done and get that final report sent off.
So with that, I guess the question to the group is, okay, we can get that posted to the website. We'll probably want to do a press release, but the question I had is, again, it kind of leads back into the outreach and engagement. You know, are we going to solicit comments based on that? And what's that look like? I mean, is there going to be a comment form they could log into online, send an email to Celine for us to look at or whatever, but just kind of making sure we sort of know what we're in for. Because again, you know, we've been pretty thoughtful about, we've had conversations in the public about the alternatives, but now once we finalize this, it's going to be a living document. So how do we manage that? And I want to make sure we create a good conduit for public comment too.
I agree. I think in this day and age of public forums, I think unmoderated public forums are not all that productive. So as far as just some comment board or something like that, I prefer to have a clear conduit for making public comment, whether that be an email to Celine or whether that's something like that. That's a clear conduit that is more of an investment than just making a comment on a comment board that just publicly pops up. I don't know anywhere.
It'd be directed
at some sort of direct communication that is productive.
Celine, we could possibly create an email that's specifically geared towards just that. So your email's not.
Very helpful.
Something you could monitor.
Oh, that's a good idea.
I mean, the back end will be UINO.edu, but certainly something that, yeah, these comments could go directly to.
PBAC complaint department head.
What were you
Jay Lanigan, we already have police basin something at Gmail, which is the one that,
Where the survey went to.
Ashley, yeah, we already have that, that's where the survey went.
That's another one we could do. Probably have to.
Sometimes I'm leery when the other folks aren't, if I get a random Gmail, it doesn't seem official, then I'm like more likely to
That's true.
pass over. That's true. Just, I mean, again, I'm just throwing that out there for food for thought. It's, if it's a clickable something, even if it is the Gmail that they can click on and self-select and put in a comment.
Yeah, do we provide at least an initial end date to the initial comments? I mean, I think it would be wise to say,
Absolutely.
you know, we'll review initial comments. This
Yeah,
date.
please submit your comment by X.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't mean that they, or if you don't think so, I'll keep it open-ended.
I think open-ended for now, I really do.
Just allow them to keep.
Yeah.
submitting.
And I think we've got time.
Yeah, and we'll see this in the next discussion items, but we do want to do a leadership roundtable with all the entities and different leadership, and then go to the states and everything like that. So I don't know if we're ready to go to the public and do a whole presentation. It's just that, here's the report, we're still doing some work, and then that gives us, me and Robin, some time to work on an outreach plan.
Well, and I would like,
Together.
even the report piece, I think it would be good to have that go to the university leadership and our electeds first.
Definitely.
That they, I think that they need to see that first before just the general public rollout. And then for the general public rollout, I think it would be effective if we produce an explanatory video, just with a human being explaining that can be attached to it, because I think we have a lot of people who are gonna just process information differently, and a long, 20+ page document with a lot of charts and graphs is not gonna be how a lot of our, I think we'll get more engagement if we have somebody just explaining with some images and stuff, and that's something that I think both cities and certainly the universities have people that can help produce something like that.
But Tyler, no offense, but you have a face made for radio.
So what good is that feedback rap that I wrote last year? You spent all that time?
Wait, there's a wrap?
Oh, I've had this queued up for a long time.
Oh, my God.
Yeah, poetry slam at the symposium was really good. Josh.
Well, Robin's presentation that I saw when she did with the Women County Association of Realtors, that was great. I don't know if you want to.
Well,
I
that's kind
think
of
it
what I
is
was
recorded,
thinking.
isn't it? Don't we have a recording of it? I thought somebody said that we did.
Maybe the voters might have. It
Okay.
seems like, I mean.
Or we could build a new one, but what I'm saying is,
Yeah.
we have the building blocks already in place.
I think you want to just tee up the report.
Yeah, I think just a 3-minute intro, teeing up the report and giving the content, basically summarizing the content in a really digestible manner. Because you're gonna have a lot of people that's all they do. And then you're gonna have some people that are more interested that may dive in deeper, but I think Robin's perfect to do it. I'll back up the hands for it.
So are we gonna do an executive summary?
Just died.
You know, have we talked about an executive summary for this
I
guy?
hadn't planned that one.
Pardon me?
I hadn't planned that one, but maybe that we could do.
For the report?
I mean, just
Well, I guess the report has an executive.
Yeah.
summary.
okay,
Yeah.
all right, so are we gonna, okay,
But-
so we could make that a separate document
The
too.
one thing though, with the report is it includes everything that we've done, and so there's probably some things that people aren't interested in.
We need to
versus
do,
just the alternative.
we need to do like a final summary for just the 2 recommendations, for 2.5.
Or a message.
3.5.
I think the messaging is really important, so the way that we craft that message is gonna be
Okay.
key.
And I think we can route that back to our communication subcommittee and help workshop that.
Yeah, we'll figure that out, yeah. I didn't mean to dish
No.
executive summary, I'm just like, okay.
Well, I think,
Based on what we're talking about today, do we need to sort of,
well, I think the executive summary, the executive summary that is eventually attached to the final report.
yes,
That's one document.
Yeah.
And then the 3-minute, the PSA, whatever we're calling it, that's the public face document, that's our.
in all reality, most people are gonna just read the executive summary. So we want to make sure that it's really.
But that executive summary does need to get updated with our recommendation.
Yeah, well, I think we could have an outreach plan or something, man. I think we should try as many mechanisms as possible. Some people will gravitate towards the video. I don't always like listening to sound because I find it annoying, so, or put subtitles, or, I think we just need to try multiple.
I think that's, I mean, it's the mantra of communication now is that there's a lot, you have to use all of the available means of communicating anymore. And so I think that, yeah, having the longer document, having the short executive summary, having the video interface that we're trying to get in all of those
Or you
ways.
can do the TikTok dance.
Basically.
Yeah. This is where my backup dancing comes in. It's like ball bearings, I swear.
Tyler on TikTok. But seriously, on YouTube, yeah.
He doesn't fit the public works.
Nancy has something she wants to ask.
Well, thank you, or to offer. The League of Women Voters Moscow just voted to assemble a speaker series, and we want to have one of them on the water alternatives. I sent Celine an invitation to speak to the group, but if this group wants to use that as part of its public outreach venue, we would try to make it a huge event that would be open to a broader audience. So if you all are interested in that, I'll pitch it to our planning committee and see if we can switch the dates around.
Yeah, please, Nancy, that'd be great.
Thank you.
I think so. Thank you.
And don't forget, we have the water summit.
We do have the water summit, so we can.
Wait for it.
That's
I
another.
know, you're jumping ahead.
Okay, let's say that.
Next item.
Okay.
Okay, so Robin, after that discussion, timeline for the final, or
Oh, final.
Timeline for the final will be in the next 2 weeks.
2 weeks? Okay.
Yeah.
You're good with that?
I'm good with that. It's essentially done. There's
Okay.
just
All right.
really incorporating these things and
Okay.
that's it.
Keep in mind, the water summit's in October. You don't want to talk about water summit. I want to talk about the water summit.
It's on the calendar. Okay, now we don't have to do this.
Okay, and I don't know, I was trying to, there's a list of things on here, and maybe I just need to put everything on here because we're already talking and hitting on certain other things that are in here, so maybe I'll just list them all up here. But then we'll still go back in order. So, item number 3, member entity information dissemination. So this is where, the different entities, you are representatives of those entities. And so trying to look at what are the next steps? And so having, like Jeff, talk to somebody at Washington State, who is it that he needs to talk with? And maybe that detail of information doesn't need to be shared here, but as long as he knows who he's going to be talking with. And, everybody looks at things or understands things differently. Some people want to take a look at the report and then hear about it later. Other people will want somebody to feed it to them first, and then they can dive into the report. So really, I guess, and we can talk about the timeline, but it's, I guess, having a discussion on how each of you is going to give this report to your entities, and then we'll have that leadership roundtable, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later.
Yeah, one of my concerns, again, we want to be respectful of the elected officials you all represent and making sure they get their eyes on it before they get a phone call from somebody like, what? So again, I want to make sure that timing is good and you give your member entity leadership a chance to have their eyes on it first.
Yeah, so I think probably the best, that should be incorporated into an outreach plan, something that we formalize as far as an outreach plan, and just leave it to our representatives from each entity to tell us what that looks like. It's like in my situation, it'd be a presentation to my city council, and I'm sure probably like the Pullman's as well, just be a formal presentation to the city council, where we introduce the document, distribute the document, and something like that. Universities are a little different, so they tell us what that looks like on their end.
Tyler, do you think that you would have a separate presentation, or that we would just invite them to that leadership roundtable?
I think it would be beneficial to have a separate council presentation that I give to individually to my city council, and then that gives them the context, provides the document so that they're better prepared to come to that leadership roundtable with feedback for that roundtable. So with the council presentation not being more of an introduction to the document, and then the roundtable will be the opportunity to discuss their thoughts on the document.
That sounds good.
Is that how the other entities would do that?
That's my only thought with that is, are you talking to council Are you talking a private council presentation that you're?
No, I
doing, or are you
wouldn't,
talking-
I don't think we'd workshop, but I think it would be a 15-ish minute introduction to document presentation that we would give in a council meeting.
And I think that works, although from a timing standpoint, media or anyone can grasp onto that at any point and push it out before other people potentially have a chance to do it. So I think that is the right avenue. I worry maybe unnecessarily that the timing might be hard, and so you might end up getting it out sooner than some people have a chance to potentially, maybe not.
Well, I think if we have a schedule for a council presentation, then we can distribute the document to the council
In advance.
prior to the presentation, which is
Okay.
typically what we do with a lengthy document for them
works.
anyway. So they have a few weeks to digest it before we actually show up and talk to them about it. So at that point, they would have the document, and that may head off some of those concerns.
That works.
Would you envision having a short presentation or something available for us to use with our council or?
We can put a slide, we can put a slide there.
A couple of slides just to prompt us through the steps, that'd be helpful.
That's consistent messaging too. I think the consistent messaging.
One of the things that's been helpful in the past when we've done these meetings, especially with electeds, is we try and have representatives from the different entities participating in PBAC attend. And so like I would anticipate Karen, myself, and Saline as the leadership group trying to be at as many of these, one of us at least trying to be at as many of these as we can to help them have Robin at any of them that she can be.
Yeah, I'm happy to present too.
Yeah.
Hence the reason to extend the contract, right?
I got it easy. My chairman's sitting right there. Tom, can we do this?
But if Karen, Tyler, and I are not welcome, you all can go to your leadership by yourself too. However, if you want to look at it.
You guys are always welcome. And having the experts on the material is always helpful.
No, that might be, you're going too far.
No, you guys don't.
Oh, we gotta listen to the
experts for here.
We gotta listen to Mark all the time.
Yeah. They too me out, like in 2 seconds flat there.
For going on a limb here, I guess I can say to Kara earlier, the lion. For Pullman to have that document available to council members outside of the packet, city council packet system would be good. So they have that 2-3 week window that somebody mentioned. So they'll have that. And then when we get, the Pullman calendar is always way too complex. So when we get a chance to do that presentation and whether it's Robin or Saline, depending on travel schedules and how things go, that we have that public facing summary that we put out at that time to council. I mean, it'll be in the council packet, but that'll be the presentation that you do live in front of council. So it's the same information that goes live to council as goes to the public. We don't confuse. We don't have too many complicating factors there. It's to really mount it on rails. This is what we came up with. This is how we did it. Here's where we're at. Does that make sense? Does that?
Yeah.
We'll have a slide deck that everyone will have.
Yeah.
Consistent, sweet, short and sweet.
Consistent.
Plus the final report that we're finishing.
Just that one.
Please
Rarely. Yeah, but
It's always the message. Right?
No, it's so
Has to have.
many guns and lawyers.
No.
So for the cities and counties, there's public meetings for the universities, how.
Yeah, I was just sitting here thinking about the right way to disseminate things on our side. What residential population we have is probably not going to engage. And most of the feedback, I imagine, and questions will be related to finances. So that's probably Jason and I's court to just run that up the flagpole in the right way.
I'm probably gonna engage BP Chris Nimmer and his thoughts on the process. I know he's already been introduced and engaged with this committee in the past, in understanding that, and and seeing how he wants to receive the information and go from there. Because largely is who do we want to get it in from? I know this will also lend to working with our research side of it to go like, hey, this is the way forward when we talk about our contribution on the research side. This will lend to that as well.
I know Becky has been engaging with President Green on the topic as well, so you get in front of the respective presidents in some form, and whether that.
Yeah, I think engaging Chris will be the lead into the earworm to the president's offices. Because what I would hate to do is get something in front of President Green that he will have questions for and will engage with his cabinet and then they not have the answers for. So putting it on Chris's radar is something, if you can get behind and maybe engage the president in a different way.
I think one of our outreach action items is engaging with our university research faculty too. Can come a little bit more on you. Based on the findings of this, are there some research opportunities that we can leverage at those schools?
Paul, what do you think about Lake County? For the presentation, the letter with Lake County?
Yes, yeah, I think that's what the Lake County Commission want.
You want timing? And I asked that because I know I don't want
We
to
could
it
come-
in, but that puts potentially a timeline, right?
And we actually have timeline is like the next slide.
Okay.
So I was gonna go through all the discussions and
That's
then
fine, we can come back.
if that's okay, or if we want to have timing right now, we can do that too.
Let me just, okay, so Water Summit, October 18th.
Yeah.
Okay, our keynote is Robert Glennon. All right.
Okay.
So he's a emeritus faculty member, distinguished fellow from University of Arizona. He's written quite a few books. He's one of the top. Robert Glennon, Glennon.
And I'm
Just got that confirmed.
I'm
last
less
week.
asking because of that, although I'd like to hear it, but more of a, are we planning to do this mini presentation at that? Or is
Oh,
that
yeah.
getting
Oh,
pushed?
yeah.
So,
Yeah.
so that puts a timeline on
Yeah.
how soon we.
Yeah, that's just one of the outreach opportunities.
I would anticipate, I mean, what I'm planning on just tentatively is I would take this to my council's second September meeting. And so as soon as the document's finalized, I distribute it to my council. So if we're saying 2 weeks, mid-August, I will get it to my council so they'd have about a month with it. And then mid-September is when I take it to council. So that they've had that
in front of them.
And then that will give us the opportunity to release it public facing document in advance of the water summit. That we could kind of maybe drum up water summit interest. And so ideally, I think we're going to release maybe a week or so in advance the public facing document and encourage people to come to the water summit for a better explanation of what's in the document, because that way it's a chance to roll that up to the public in a meaningful way for people who are going to be interested.
And then the leadership roundtable would probably be after the summit, just because of how many meetings and stuff.
Probably.
Sean, would mid-September be realistic for you guys to get it out of your council?
Yeah, that would work great, especially if we've got the final product on the report in a couple weeks.
And then we could work with the commissioners. We could work pretty simple.
Pretty easy, yeah. I mean, really, truly, for us, I think it's probably good to do it maybe sooner than later, because we're starting into budget talks and things like that. And have this program, on everybody's mind, on importance and all that.
This sounds like a weird comment, but harvest is about to start.
Well, that's
County
true.
for any kind of public involvement.
Yeah.
It destroys what the county for any
Yeah.
involvement.
Yeah, I forget about that.
Well, I'm not a farmer either.
Gonna be a late
October fest,
That's right, students are back.
No more water summit questions for me. Sorry.
Promise doesn't.
That was just a timeline.
Yeah.
We could summarize that.
Yeah.
Remember the farmers that-
We are
Yeah.
4:25, just for time's sake.
Oh, boy, okay, we gotta move on.
Yep, we got it.
But I think we're doing good, yeah, okay. All right, the next one is ex officio member agency feedback, ecology and IDWR. So I'm gonna put Michelle and Patrick on the spot, but first what I mean by this, it's not, looking at the draft and getting comments, it's really what are the next steps within the agencies to be able to make sure that everybody that should know about this knows about this? Do we need to have, have meetings, like we met with ecology twice already? Yeah, and so I'm gonna let, I gave Patrick a heads up. I didn't give Michelle a heads up, sorry, but if you could just share a little bit from your end, please. Thanks.
So there's a tool or mechanism already in place for ecology to provide a little more feedback. Ecology has a pre-application process. So before an application for water right comes in, we encourage and now often require people to come meet with us in a pre-application setting. So we can, notice and bring up red flags when we see there's something that's going to kill the deal from the beginning. We can bring it up before an application is submitted. And I think that's a really good tool that PBAC or whoever is, whatever projects the group decides when it's time to move forward. As much specificity as you can bring in the pre-application is going to help. Right now, the answers we've given have been pretty broad and vague because the details are pretty broad and vague, right? There's a general project in this area on this stream, and it's been a pretty vague answer. But if you're able to bring us in that pre-application setting, instantaneous and annual quantities, where are you actually looking to divert water? Where is that water going to be put to use? What season of the year is it going to be put to use? As many of those details as you can bring to a pre-app meeting, we can give some very specific answers and very specific guidance on how to proceed. So that would be, I think, the right tool for outreach with ecology next. And in each project or each water right application would require a separate pre-application meeting, and we could lump them together, right? If they, we have 2 or 3 different projects, we could talk them all at the same meeting. But there may be different answers for each of those depending on the project. And there might be some different guidance depending on what that project, what the specific details are. But that would be the appropriate next step for us.
Would you do those meetings with us?
Yeah, so that would involve myself, and it's really the group that the people have met with before myself. Dan Collison, who's our permitting unit supervisor. Jamie would be there as part of those. And we might involve a water master in those meetings. That would be the call we'd have to make internally. But it would be 3 or 4 folks. And we have the ability to speak to whatever details are brought to them.
But as a courtesy, we get you the final report when it's finished.
Absolutely, yes.
Just take your eyes out, not expecting.
Yeah. And the pre-application meetings, those are, sometime down the road.
Yeah, okay.
And just kind of as a general FYI, within the Eastern Region of Ecology, we've kind of made a focus to spend time working in one watershed and then move to a different watershed. So we're in WIRE 34, Water Resources Inventory Area 34. And we're in the 2 to 4 year time period for working on WIRE 34 right now. On those applications. So the time frame actually works out, could conceivably work fairly well.
Okay.
There are some applications that sit on our shelves for 20 years. I don't think that would be the case for these, but I will deny that I ever promised that it'll be short.
This is recording.
That's cool, that's cool.
Good to know.
Patrick,
We'll just caveat it all.
So Patrick, would you give the final report to the board in that meeting?
Yeah.
Okay.
Let's go with that. I'll go with that.
Oh, and the people at Ecology, Jamie and Dan, they are very curious what feedback is going to recommend. So.
And Michelle, how about IDWR?
Yeah, so we could certainly have pre-application meetings with folks. We cannot start an actual permit process based on speculation or without proper funding secured or the ability to complete the process in a designated time frame. So the actual permitting would be far down the road, but we could give you guidance, I guess, on your approach. And one thought I had, just in listening and understanding that this is a 50-year timeline for the project, it could be that we have what's called RAFIN applications for municipal providers. We might consider that stands for reasonably anticipated future needs. And so that might be an appropriate approach, maybe just something that we could consider with you. And we could also assist with if a dam or storage facility is considered as going forward. We could look at and provide dam structure review. So those are some thoughts I had. Yeah, let us know if you are interested in meeting.
Okay,
Definitely.
thanks, Michelle.
Thank you. Okay, moving on to number 5, other agency report, dissemination and feedback with the tribe. So we had met with the Nez tribe several months ago, and so getting them the report and then seeing if they want to meet, and we'll just kind of go over, happy to meet with them again. The other one is fisheries agencies. So I did talk with Steve with Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife. So we had met with the 2 national fisheries agencies as well as both state fisheries agencies. Got some just unofficial feedback from them, I guess. And so really what we would be looking for is not just say, hey, here's the final report, but it's really getting that nitty-gritty feedback as much as we can. Like Kara said, they may not be able to provide a lot of details because we're still moving forward with a couple of them. But I did get some positive feedback that they may be able to give us, they may be able to actually look at the data that we have. So Anchor QEA looked at tow widths and fish and things like that, where there actually is some data that they could look at to give us some feedback. And so really asking, would they be willing to do that? Would they be willing to say more than just a feeling of, actually looking at that data? And then if they don't think there is enough water, well, what could be, is there some mitigation efforts that could be done? So really getting to that next step with them is what I'd like to see.
Or maybe they can tell us what we need to provide to them and build that into a work plan.
So it seems like a possibility, although I haven't talked with Idaho, but Washington sounded, I got positive feedback from it. So I guess we'll talk about timing next on that, but okay, any other discussion on that one? Okay, public and site outreach plan. So we already have the outreach plan that we developed, I don't know, more than a year ago. So continuing to follow that, we haven't had a site meeting for a while, so having a site meeting, I would say relatively soon. Sharing that final report with them.
We'll update the outreach plan that we have. It's still really solid. Just update it and populate it with additional groups, opportunities. We also have a strategic communication plan that we will update with new messaging. So again, I think we can just clean that one up pretty quickly. So I'm happy to help with that. The communication subcommittee is happy to help with that.
Okay. Question?
Just a comment regarding public information. Since this affects everyone within the basin and outside the basin as far as water flowing, I know some people that do not have the internet out where if the Flanagan Creek number 3 were to be chosen. I'm wondering if, as people understand what's coming, and it might affect them in some way, and also if we go with modified number 4, which wants to engage conservation. If this has already been done, I apologize, but I wonder if if it could be assessed with the public how they would like to contribute or how they would like to learn about it, rather than just send out something over the the website, people don't have a computer, they can't respond. Well, I don't have internet, I'd like to get it in the newspaper or on the radio, or I'd like to see something at my post office. I know we lost the Viola post office, but you know, there's little communities all over. There might be community buildings, or we have the Viola Community Center, and there's a board that they are always announcing meetings. I can definitely envision a water future meeting posted on there. We have little community newsletters. There's a one from the Potlatch area. It goes out. You don't subscribe. It just goes out to people within that mailing area, I think. And that has tons of ads, and you know, there could be an announcement for a meeting, or so I'm just thinking maybe we need to, instead of us assuming how to notify people on an ongoing basis, is to actually ask people, how would you like to learn about this? Are you interested? Would you like to hear things on the radio or in the newspaper or on the newsletter, or post it at the community building, or visiting, come speak to our community? And you might get a little bit of response, and then you would know better how people want to be notified, how they want to learn about this.
So Jeannie, thank you. That's great feedback. And the answer is yes. Yeah, we're not going to make assumptions that everybody gets information one way or another way. So
right, I understand that.
And also piggybacking on that, we've got some funding committed through ARPA through Latah County, and part of that will be really reaching out to rural communities around water conservation. And we'll use that as an opportunity to say and ask some questions around how would you like to get information? How do you get information? So yeah, great comment.
We also got some feedback from that poll too, about people, like, so, yeah, so we have an outreach plan that we developed on August last year sometime that looked at, talking at farmers markets, or giving presentations, or doing certain things. And so I like some of your ideas that you had.
A lot of it was social media oriented though, and not everybody belongs to social media.
I know Whitman County is committed to building some fiber connectivity in rural areas. Contact, and get some fiber out there.
Yeah, that's on Fulton.
Yeah,
so I guess
it's true though. It is. It's like you just assume people get it that way, but not everybody does.
You could even have a little slip of paper with a couple questions on it and say, submit your comments and mail to this address, and then somebody could get it.
We can get creative.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think the bottom line is people continue to do outreach, that it's always going to be happening. I know that Viola had talked with us about doing a presentation, so.
And find new means and methods.
Right.
Those are good suggestions.
Yeah.
We have 20 minutes left.
20 minutes,
so-
okay. All right, I think the next two are gonna go relatively quick. Paul, I'm gonna let you talk about those funding opportunities, short-term, long-term, and then regional water conservation targets.
Yeah, so once we get the final report, I think we will shop that with, certainly with Iowa Water Resource Board, their planning folks, because they did express some interest and support for whatever path we go forward with. So we'll explore what those opportunities might look like. And then again, there's some great resource guides out there with the bipartisan infrastructure law. I just found a really cool resource guide. So we can start looking at some of those things too, identifying that. Yeah.
I would throw out again, Paul, that I think we mentioned before, the Office of Columbia River and ecology. Once there is a path forward that's decided on, and there is a project, I would approach the Office of Columbia River.
Okay.
Their mission, their legislative aim is to aggressively pursue new water supplies. And they provide significant funding throughout the state, primarily Eastern Washington, but they have statewide projects.
Sure.
In the realm of new water supply. So
that's great.
Once there's a project, once there's a path I would contact them.
Thank you.
So does that mean, I guess based on what you heard, how we're, maybe the recommendation would be alternative, modified alternative 4, with the other two kind of hanging back? Do they have to lose the other two hanging back, or are they going to be?
That's a good question. I think that they would want to have a fairly concrete path forward before they commit to funding. Because Office of Columbia River, they approach the legislature and request funding for projects. And they, I mean, depending on the project, and it's easy for me to speak for them because I'm not part of them. But I mean, they commit real dollars.
Yeah.
And serious dollars to projects. But I think that they would want a concrete, this is the plan before they're going to commit.
What's it on the process?
Yeah.
Patrick, I'll get contact from you on that. I think we talked a little bit when that big water rights transfer. Was that?
Yes. Yeah, with I have contracts for it.
Okay, Paul already talked about the water summit in October, or anything else you want to add?
What about the regional water research?
We'll need money.
Oh, yeah, okay, the conservation targets.
Well, no, again, I think in the, in the months ahead, and I know I've talked with Sean, and, part of what I had hoped when Amy Vickers was here last year as our keynote, is that we would bring her back. And then, I think we should consider bringing her back to really help us sort of refine some of those water conservation strategies, both short-term and long-term. And I think it's even more important. And, again, I can't speak or direct the entities to say what's a reasonable water conservation target. But again, I think with all of these alternatives, I think it's incumbent upon us to really build in some aggressive water conservation targets. It just is. I don't know what that looks like though. That's why bring an expert like Amy back.
Yeah, Moscow's, we're in the process of updating our water conservation plan right now. So we're just completing our research phase and document review for stuff that's being done nationally and internationally, and trying to come up with our feasible list of stuff. So we'll have an updated plan to start taking the council process next spring.
So I talked with Amy about a month ago, and she's like, "Hey, just let me know when."
Yeah.
So. And I thought we could bring her back maybe for like 2 days.
That's part of our process.
Spend a day in each community kind of thing, or spend with the universities as well, or WSU and Pullman one day, and ULI and Moscow another day.
It would be interesting to have that conversation.
Get your AMI done.
All right, you ready to move on? The last item is PBAC Leadership Roundtable. So with this, I think we had some good discussion earlier on really what the next steps are to disseminate information into the entities, and then coming back and having a leadership roundtable. So timing, it sounds like I guess we'll talk timing, but that would be after the water summit. And I didn't know, we don't have a lot of time left, and I do think we need to talk some with timing, but also I think it would be good to have at least the start of this conversation of what do we want to get out of that leadership roundtable? What are some goals from that? Since theoretically then everyone will have already heard it, had a chance to kind of talk amongst themselves. And then really, what do we want to get out of that roundtable?
Well, I think partly in fairness to the entities, it's like, we hope to have full consensus, right? And not just at this table, but with the electeds and the leadership at each of the institutions. So I think, and I'm not making the assumption that we have consensus. I don't think we should. I've got blind spots, everybody does. So that gives us some time to now and then, you guys will inform your entities and challenge them to come to the roundtable with some solid support.
So do we think that's a reasonable outcome, that we could have that from the roundtable?
I think it's reasonable. I think with the messaging up front and the messaging that's gone out throughout and just my interaction with the different entities, I think it's reasonable that we can come out of that. I think it's important that we do at some point, whether it be in that meeting or a subsequent meeting, because, you know, all of the state entities that we talk to, like all the funding entities, the benefit that we have is that we're all sitting around this table together, and it's not a bunch of attorneys sitting around this table together, and that having full-throated time. Having full-throated support of that group coming out, with just a consensus on direction will be important.
And I think too, that's the kind of opportunity we can tee up, is the governance structure right to do what we want to do going forward too. I mean, we talked about, you know, with a big Snake River project, we need a different entity to drive this project. It's not this group of volunteers, maybe not. What's that look like? Do we need to create something more formalized that has a lot more authority than we do? So I think we can explore some of that and have those conversations at that roundtable as well.
The other thing about this leadership roundtable though is that we won't have, we're recommending a couple alternatives, but we still need to do a lot more research, a lot more data finding, fact finding, all that stuff. So going to those leaders and saying, are you okay with these? We're going to keep moving forward.
It's more just buy in, check in, and it's like continue forward.
So we're really not asking for them to pick an alternative. We're asking for their buy-in on the direction that we're going with the continued refinement.
Right.
And the continued funding is important.
This next slide, I'll do these. I basically just copied these from the report, the next term, or the near-term next steps, but I thought it would help with this discussion. And so the first one is obtaining consensus amongst the PBAC members. So that's what we did today. So that's really, really good. So the next is in their representative entities to decide which alternatives to move forward, just like the other side. So that's really what the outcome of the roundtable will be, to round out this first bullet. Then some of these other things can happen in parallel, and also some are going to have to do stair step, but obtaining consensus among the state agencies and determining the final authority over the project. So who really gets to say which alternative ultimately will be chosen? Determining a governance structure, utility or joint powers arrangement to enable funding and regulatory negotiations, to determine responsibilities for the next steps, developing a funding strategy and how to equitably pay for these alternatives amongst entities and their constituents, developing an implementation plan for these alternatives that include additional public engagement, creating a written agreement between the communities for implementation, and then if PBAC or the entities choose to move forward with alternatives 1 or 2, seeking guidance from the states on how to legally move water from one state to the next. So none of these even get into any of the engineering or the science questions about these alternatives. It's really just the other structure for it.
Patrick, was that a snicker, a sneer?
No, that was a good one.
That was like, oh, well, these seem like really good questions on the leadership roundtable too. The leadership roundtable in my mind is cities, counties, and presidents of universities, but do we need to have folks from the states there as well for that leadership roundtable?
Yeah.
And I think determining who
Yeah, that would be a great question,
Michelle and Idaho Water Resource Board, who should be there.
Well, I think it's important to keep in mind too that like this is our challenge. The technical side is not the challenge for this. Like any of these, we can engineer the thing to work, to actually technically work. Practically making it work, and practical truth beats technical truth every time. And this is the practical truth. If we can't make that work, none of us can work. So I think it is really important to just remain in focus as we get through that.
And we won't answer all these questions at the roundtable, but at least it's people need to be starting to think about these kinds of things.
Probably the real challenges.
Jeff and Jason, don't send your night fleet manager. Sit around.
He's probably a good guy, but.
Yeah.
So we're gonna get to timeline.
Okay, yeah, now let's move on. So I guess the other next steps would be like maybe a formal rate study, data gaps with some of these recommended alternatives. So things that we can do in parallel as we're working on this other.
That helps with the messaging too.
Okay,
The rate
so
study is important, also. Great thing about it, but.
next step to timeline, it's basically the same list. So we already talked about the Alta contract. So I'll work on that. The final report's middle date within the next 2 weeks, probably even sooner than that, but I'm just giving extra time. Member entity information dissemination. So it sounds like we are looking at, pretty soon with those reports, and then maybe those presentations in September.
September, October before the summit.
Before the summit. And then how do you want to do disseminating the report? Is it going to first go to the entities, let the leadership look at it first? Okay.
Yeah, I think that's how we need to do it. I think we need to be respectful of that. So I think we disseminate the leadership first. And then pretty quickly after that, we can go public facing. That's where it needs to go first.
So we need 3 pieces of collateral, the full report, an executive summary as a standalone, and then we'll build the slide deck. Yeah.
Okay. Ex officio member agency feedback. So would this be, I guess they'll get the report the same, feedback is the report, they'll get the report. I don't know, do you have any feeling for timing in terms of, they see the report, they see the final report, we should have, it'd be good to have another meeting, or would it be good to really take a look at those pre-application forms? Or do you want to think about it?
Let me think about that
Okay.
one.
Yeah.
Yeah, let me think about that.
Okay, Michelle, do you have any thoughts on that?
The more you know when we meet, the more productive the meetings will be.
Okay. So that makes sense.
And then I did think too, while I was just standing here, working with department or DEQ, Department of Environmental Quality, as soon as you know enough to do that would be great. That process for public water systems is a long process.
Okay. Other agency report dissemination and feedback. So do we want to do that about the same time as the public? Or what do you think for the tribes and the fisheries? The fisheries, they're not waiting for anything. That's really us seeking them out to get their feedback. But
I'd follow on after we get out to our entities and our ex officios.
Yeah.
I don't think we're gonna be asking any feedback, or are we? We'll just kind of leave it open-ended, but like the next first try.
okay. Public outreach and public insight outreach plan. I think that'll just continue. We'll look for opportunities.
We'll refine that and have something ready in August. Okay.
Some of this will hinge on when our contract gets signed.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay. Or modified, yeah. Okay. Anything else? We have 6 minutes to spare.
The summit, is it, I assume it's in person?
Yeah, we're gonna be at SDL. That's it. Yep. Got it.
Awesome.
So, you could go around and just ask how everybody feels. How do you feel, Tim?
Tim's had beer though.
So just let her rip.
Okay. You're good? Yeah, if you guys want another drink. Lisa, I'm not kicking you out of here.
Anyone online? Any other
Anybody else?
Questions or comments?
I can DoorDash if you want to.
Anybody else?
I was just going to quickly say thank you for all the work that's being done.
Hold on one second. We have a comment from virtual world, everybody. Okay.
Okay, go ahead. Oh, hi there. I just wanted to say thank you for all the work that's being done. A question I'm going to bring to the Water Summit with me. I've worked for many years across different interfaces and different projects, and 6 years when we're not actually at the permitting stage yet. I'm worried we're going to be longer than 6 years. So the question I'm going to bring to the Water Summit is, what is our plan for the next 6 to 10 years? While in the meantime, the alternate water supply project is being worked on step by step. But what do we do in reality for the next 6 to 8 years? That's going to be my question for the Water Summit. Just.
Thanks, Pamela. I like that question. I think that's a great question.
And I think modified alternative 4 talked about conservation measures. And that's
Trying to amp those up.
The easy
That's the
thing,
quick
what
one.
we can do.
No pressure.
Well, easier.
Easier.
John already talked to us.
Thank you, Pamela. All right. Anyone else over there?
All right.
Thanks for including us.
Yes.
Thanks for joining us,
Thanks for
everybody.
joining.
Thanks, everyone. Appreciate it.
Okay.
Yep.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Okay. Steve will